Welcome back. So, the title of this mini lecture is Defining Sport. Let's get into it. So, first things first, let's deal with definitions. So, if we were to go to either something like the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, or if we're to go to something like the Cambridge Dictionary, they're going to have definitions for sport or sports. Now, there are different versions of the use of this term, but as it relates to this, and again, I'm going to be either quoting or paraphrasing from both of those specific dictionaries. You're looking at, for Merriam-Webster, quote, physical activity engaged in for pleasure, end quote. For Cambridge, you're looking at, quote, a game, competition, or activity needing physical effort and skill that is played or done according to rules for enjoyment and or as a job, end quote. All right, so in both of those cases, particularly with the Merriam-Webster definition, we have fairly broad interpretations of this, because that concept or debate of what constitutes, is this a sport? Is this not a sport? It can make for good sort of conversation and debate, certainly, of course, on sports talk radio and in other, sort of places and platforms. But it's also a really important one for validating culture and for understanding whether or not groups and communities and individuals, of course, can feel seen or in some cases feel that there's a great deal of cultural bias being placed against them. So, it's important for us to be able to understand that defining sport is a relatively broad thing. And so it's important for us to recognize that what constitutes sport can often be sort of within the eye of the beholder. So it's important for us to be able to recognize that and to be able to be mindful of the biases that we might perhaps have as we're looking at this. So I'm thinking of three specific sports or three sporting cultures in particular that when it comes to this idea of biases or national debates or conversations not validating things, these would be probably good examples, right? So the first that I'm thinking of is NASCAR, right? So for a while, NASCAR and the sport of kind of motorsport racing was something that was not necessarily, at least in the history of the United States, considered sort of a mainline traditional sport that many were, individuals were engaging in, right? Baseball was quote unquote America's pastime. And in the second half of the 20th century, you had sports like football and basketball that were growing in their popularity and in their connections to communities and culture really across the U.S. Globally too, but across the U.S. NASCAR grew though, right? It grew incredibly prominently, and motor racing and other forms of that kind of racing grew prominently, so much so that the stock car, and racing of NASCAR, by the time you get to the 1990s, is pretty well established as an incredibly important event for cultures and communities in parts of the United States. So we have to acknowledge certain biases that might be sort of present there. And that if we look at the definitions, of course, of what constitutes a sport, right, that kind of contest and competition, certainly would probably meet those definitions. The other two examples that I'm thinking of, one, the debate has gone on for 30 or 40 years, or if not much longer actually, but a good one for us to be mindful of here with this is cheerleading, and then also, of course, esports. So let's talk about cheerleading first. So cheer or cheerleading, you're going to have, of course, groups and communities of cheer teams that are a part of events and sporting competitions all around the country at any number of levels, be it from early middle school or junior high through high school and college and even into other forms of professional athletics. Now, cheer is something that typically is often something that is done by women, but men are actively a part of this as well, and others are a part, other individuals are part of this as well. And it's important for us to be mindful of the fact that if we look at the definition of what constitutes a sport, although for many decades you saw individuals quite against validating or acknowledging or really recognizing or truly seeing that cheer was a sport in its own right, cheerleading is a sport in its own right. And it's actually an incredibly strenuous physical activity. It is an incredibly, in some cases, brutal physical activity. So I have a quote for us, and it's from the Brain Injury Association of America, and they're citing a study and an article from the Orthopedic Journal of Sports Medicine. And what they write, quote, cheerleading accounts for 65% of all catastrophic injuries, defined as severe spinal cord, or cerebral injuries occurring in female athletes. So, be it as part of the team sort of level with schools or institutions, or in competition levels, we need to acknowledge the primacy and importance of cheer, and we need to acknowledge the many gendered biases that often informed why folks, at times were against recognizing this sport. Another, and I know that we're short on time with this, is esports. We need to acknowledge that even though video gaming and gaming culture in this kind of format or platform really only rose up in the last number of decades, that it has grown in prominence and popularity, not only in the United States, but globally, and is a sport, of course, in its own way. So it's important to us to acknowledge, again, those definitions and how it's important to be flexible and to be aware of biases. Thank you very much.